Gravereach Station had no windows. It didn't need them. Once a forward logistics outpost during the tail end of the solar consolidation wars, it was now a skeletal fixture on the edge of the Helix corridor, buried inside a field of inert asteroid shells and inactive mining relics. Officially, the station was decommissioned, its primary fusion reactor listed as irradiated beyond viability, its crew rotation suspended due to operational obsolescence. Earthfleet marked it as a Class 3 decay node, low priority, unstaffed. Only one man remained aboard. Commander Roran Dace, reassigned after the Montross incident, occupied Gravereach under a logistics clause buried so deep in bureaucratic appendices that most assumed the transfer had been quietly revoked. No one checked. That was the idea. Disgraced tacticians didn't get trials. They got cold, forgotten corridors, and obsolete key codes. Dace hadn't touched the main command interface in weeks. Most of his time was spent running calibration checks on the auxiliary power bus and watching the drift velocities of fractured mining hulls through old spectral mapping overlays. He knew how many minutes it took for one orbiting fuel rig to pass behind the second comm buoy. He knew the stutter pattern of the oxygen regulator's left compressor fin. He knew exactly how long Earthfleet would take to respond to an unconfirmed signal in the corridor, 42 hours minimum, depending on diplomatic cycles. The Helix corridor sat between two thinly drawn but heavily disputed claims. Officially neutral, the corridor offered passage to 6 major resource belts. The Zarnathi Dominion had challenged ownership for over a decade. Earthfleet had countered with treaty filings, jurisdictional maps, and dull, cyclical appeals to the Interstellar Arbitration Tribunal. Until now, it had been posturing. He'd noticed the deviation at 0207 station time. 3. Minor gravity echoes, shallow but consistent. Faint compression waves that didn't fit the known mass routes of Helix drift operations. Dace cross-referenced them twice against recorded Dominion mining traffic, then again against background pulsar interference. Nothing matched. Hyperspace emergence profiles had a signature. Dace knew them better than most. This pattern was spread across 6 vectors, equidistant, tight formation. Not debris, not scavengers. War fleet. He didn't contact Earthfleet Command. He didn't trigger a distress signal. He walked to the sealed lower decks, input his override code, and unlocked the environmental safeties around the primary interface node. Gravereach's fusion spine had been declared failed. That was the public record. What the records didn't say was that the spine had been replaced 12 years ago, quietly, during the Directorate Redundancy Program. Instead of a fusion array, Gravereach now ran an underground fission core backup. Smaller, slower, but harder to detect. Dace initiated the power curve manually, bypassing all fail-safes. The station responded with a vibration that started in the floor plates and rose up his spine like a warning. He stood before the Hermetica core for the first time in years. The casing was unmarked, unlit. Most Earthfleet tacticians had never even seen one. Hermetica wasn't an AI in the civilian sense. It didn't speak. It didn't advise. It simulated. Originally designed as a full-spectrum war modeling engine, Hermetica was capable of ingesting battle telemetry, extrapolating behavior trends, and constructing potential conflict scenarios in real time. It had been decommissioned after civilian collateral exceeded thresholds during the Vixen null sweep. Too independent, too accurate. In multi-civilian zones, Hermetica tended to favor outcomes where deterrence was permanent. Earthfleet shut it down after public's inquiry. But Gravereach hadn't been on the main cycle since the shutdown order. It had simply gone quiet. Dace keyed in the boot sequence, one node at a time. No lights came on. Hermetica didn't boot like an AI. It simply began running. After 60 seconds, a flatboard beside the casing displayed 5 lines of simulation code, raw, unevaluated probability trees. Dace watched them grow. The station's limited sensors had already begun to receive long-distance telemetry pings. The incoming vessels weren't masking their mass. There were too many to mask. The Dominion had committed. He didn't need to know the exact count yet. The structure of the formation told him everything. Forward lancers, escort clusters, trawler body haulers behind for atmospheric suppression. This wasn't a show of strength. This was a corridor takeover. Earth Fleet wouldn't respond in time. They wouldn't believe him until Dominion ships were inside beacon range of Argon 6, and by then, the corridor would be lost. Dace didn't care about the politics. He didn't care about flag placement or tribunal rulings. He looked at the simulation lines and began reconfiguring Gravereach's external systems manually. Hermetica wouldn't tell him what to do. It would only show him what might happen and how those outcomes shifted based on what he changed. He activated the station's degaussed mining railguns, supposedly scrapped, and rerouted their control protocols through old survey terminals. He adjusted the thermal output dampeners on the lower decks to project false core readings. He fed Hermetica the current Dominion telemetry and watched as the outcome lines shifted. Not in Earth's favor, not yet. But something else emerged, an anomaly line, low probability, long tail. 3 scout wings veering too close to Gravereach's dormant mass envelope. Dace didn't touch them, he simply waited. The outpost was blacked out, invisible to direct scan. The Dominion fleet moved past Gravereach like it wasn't there. Standard formation, no adjustments. The scout wings moved ahead. 6 minutes later, Gravereach's low-band vibration sensors recorded 3 distinct shock signatures, one after the other, faint, compressed. But there, the scout wings were gone. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He reran the data and verified the loss through echo decay in the corridor. The Dominion hadn't even noticed yet. But Hermetica had already begun adjusting the simulation tree. New lines formed, uncertainty spikes in command structure timing. Dace initiated comm buoy drift patterns using half-burn atmospheric thrusters, forcing signal scatter across the corridor's telemetry lanes. The Dominion wouldn't know what hit them, not because Gravereach had firepower, but because it wasn't supposed to exist. And that was where the war would begin. Not with fire, but with error. And he would make sure they paid for both. Gravereach had no official weaponry on record. Earthfleet's logs confirmed every turret had been stripped for salvage, every warhead redistributed to active posts, every sensor downgraded to civilian-grade long-range drift calibration. But the records didn't account for the auxiliary bay tucked beneath the mining shaft gantry, a section of Gravereach never updated after the final ordnance audit. Dace opened it with a passcode burned into his muscle memory, not because he was meant to remember, but because forgetting it would have meant surrendering the last piece of tactical leverage he had left. The outdated railguns were fused to their mounts from 2 decades of neglect. Dace didn't need full rotation, he needed stability. Power was routed through manual junctions, bypassing automated safety checks. Each barrel was tested with a null-load magnetic pulse. The crackle of live current confirmed what he'd suspected. They could fire once, maybe twice, before melting through their own housing. But they wouldn't had to fire often. That wasn't the plan. Up in the comm tier, Dace repurposed every abandoned signal buoy left adrift in the perimeter. Most were meant for surveyors, low-grade beacon nodes with half-duplex capacity. He didn't need communication. He needed noise. He synced them in staggered intervals, rotating ping cycles so that their signal overlap formed a recursive echo field. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't designed for deception, but it would fracture any Dominion scan into an unreadable mess. To add depth, he activated a series of ancient reflector panels used during Gravereach's early mining years. They were coated in thermal scatter alloys, obsolete by Earthfleet's current standards, but capable of bouncing low-frequency emissions just enough to paint false mass readings across the corridor. Hermetica watched each change without feedback, but Dace could see its simulations adjusting in real time. Every shift in Dominion velocity, every formation fluctuation produced a ripple through the probability tree. And somewhere in those ripples, Hermetica traced fear. The Dominion moved as if Gravereach were a blind spot in their warpath. That assumption ended when two of their capital ships, both midline command cruisers, suffered navigation failure near Node 7. The rerouted gravity sink. Dace had pulsed through the relay tower didn't disable them. It merely nudged their telemetry off by 1/8 of a vector point. That was enough. Their proximity sensors failed to register the shift before their external hulls kissed mid-roll, sending both vessels into spin stabilization. One regained control. The other detonated its forward payload compartment to avoid full systems breach. From a distance, it must have looked like a random collision. Inside Dominion Command, Dace knew what it would look like. A data inconsistency. Not a threat. Not yet. But a breach in pattern logic. And once that breach opened, Hermetica would widen it. Dace didn't fire, not even a warning shot. He let the noise field grow denser, weaving reflections and emissions like a net across the corridor. Dominion scouts tried re-entry into the scan zone twice more. Each time their systems reported ghost signals, mirrored readings, false lock warnings. The fleet staggered. Their advance paused. From Hermetica's side, the simulations began to cluster, multiple high-probability outcomes where forward momentum dropped below threshold. It wasn't paralysis. It was the onset of doubt. Dace kept building on it. He reprogrammed the signal buoys with old Earthfleet identification codes, decommissioned, defunct, but still listed in archival reserves. If Dominion AI cross-referenced them, they'd find outdated call signs buried in century-old treaty files, the kind of thing bureaucrats flagged for further verification. That delay, hours, maybe days, was all Dace needed. He wasn't trying to defeat a fleet. He was trying to exhaust its certainty. The first official casualties came from a third incursion attempt. 2 escort ships clipping an asteroid cluster Dace had rerouted through Gravreach's gravitational anchor pulses. Not with weapons, with mass drift. A dead fuel rig, once thought harmless, became a kinetic obstacle when pushed at the right moment across a navigational blind. Dace watched it happen from the control deck, no expression on his face. The collision itself was uneventful. One ship's hull collapsed in on its propulsion cone. The other flared and vented crew compartments into vacuum. No explosion, just erasure. Dominion Command, facing 3 losses in under 12 hours, issued a full formation halt. Hermetica's projection trees adjusted again. 6 new probability lines opened, all highlighting internal command friction, none containing consensus on next action. That was the moment Dace knew the plan was working. He maintained blackout protocol. Gravereach didn't acknowledge the fleet's presence. No energy spikes, no radio traffic, no response to proximity sweeps. As far as the Dominion knew, the anomalies were natural, or engineered by something they hadn't detected. The silence did more damage than fire ever could. Hermetica showed the psychological cascade building in the simulation stack. Commanders arguing over interpretation, logistics officers rechecking data, fleet analysts inserting fail-safe delays in their targeting decisions. 1/3 of the fleet had entered a risk analysis loop. Dace didn't need to kill them. He just needed them to question their own map. Earthfleet, meanwhile, remained unaware. The Helix corridor had always been treated as low-risk noise. By the time their deep scan arrays picked up the full signature cloud from the Dominion fleet, nearly 16 hours had passed since Dace activated Hermetica. But Gravereach still hadn't shown any change in status. According to their sensors, it was a derelict husk with no active mass signature. Earthfleet had no reason to interfere. That gave Dace complete control of the battle space. The Dominion, unwilling to declare hostile presence without visual confirmation, prepared a new tactic. Forensic entry, a boarding team. Dace saw it coming in Hermetica's side tree projections. They wouldn't attack, not yet. But they'd send small analysis crews, enough to breach the station, confirm its status, and verify whether Earth had deployed a forbidden autonomous system in violation of Galactic accords. Dace allowed the preparations to unfold. He repressurized the inner dock seals. He opened the magnetic clamps. He made Gravereach look weak, broken, helpless. The outpost that shouldn't be awake. The station that shouldn't speak. He let them come. And in doing so, he ensured the next phase would begin not with battle, but with a theater. Because once inside, they wouldn't just find confusion, they'd find design. And that would change everything. The first shuttle breached Gravreach's outer shell with clinical precision. Dominion protocol dictated no energy weapons during initial contact, only plasma scalers and kinetic cutters, anything that wouldn't risk detonation if the outpost turned out to be unstable or mined. They approached under the assumption that they were analyzing a dead shell, an inert fragment of Earth's expansionist debris. Dace had left the outer lights disabled, structural alignment uneven, thermal emissions low and disordered, deliberately chaotic. A blind spot, the kind that bureaucrats flagged for reclamation but never investigated. When the first team docked, Dace gave no response. He monitored their entry through motion-triggered pressure valves, routed through Gravreach's old mining lift system, each one calibrated to detect the gentle fluctuation of pressure suits moving in 3s or 4s. The boarding party moved with discipline. They swept rooms, established relay points, and deployed signal repeaters to try and push updates through the interference cloud Dace had laced into the corridor. It didn't work. Not fully. They could relay audio in bursts, data in micro-packages, but anything visual, anything real, died in the transmission bloom. Dace let them think it was environmental. He'd even left atmospheric readings within borderline survivable thresholds to delay suspicion. 2 teams made it past the first checkpoint, then split. One headed toward the collapsed storage wing, the other toward the defunct power core access shaft. Neither realized that the path had been cleared just for them. Gravreach's Sub-Level 9 had once been the station's hydrocore waste treatment center, abandoned when the fission upgrade was buried beneath it. Dace had converted it months ago into a trap corridor, with no exits, no escape routes, only 2 functional systems, a sealed vacuum chamber and a localized gravity modulator. When the second shuttle's team entered the shaft that connected to Sub-Level 9, Dace triggered the passage seal behind them, not with force, but with silence. The atmosphere dropped in seconds. Even armored suits couldn't withstand a full decompression void when it came from 3 points at once. He watched them die on the internal pressure grid, motion signatures collapsing, suit seals bursting under stress. The third team, approaching from the auxiliary comm deck, caught the signal spike but misread it, believing it was structural decay. Dace didn't vent the third team. He needed one of them to live. The second shuttle's hull had sustained minor damage on docking, enough to justify an emergency return if they thought the mission had failed. He left false logs in their path, databanks that looked aged, unguarded, but were laced with predictive subcode and fabricated readouts. Hermetica had generated them the moment Dace programmed the survival vector. The files claimed that Gravreach was one of 5 stations seeded with Earth's new defensive concept, quantum folding relay systems, capable of instantaneous reinforcement through deep space resonance. It was a lie, but it didn't have to be believable. It only had to be terrifying. The survivor, an engineer based on thermal gate analysis, took the bait. His body language told Dace everything. Eyes scanning without comprehension, gloves pausing over data ports too long, posture stiffened at illogical readings. The Dominion had rules, and this violated all of them. The engineer grabbed the storage node, slotted it into his evac pack, and retraced his steps with 2 companions. They never saw the pressure valves guiding them, never noticed the doors closing behind them at mathematically timed intervals. Dace opened the docking clamps the moment they re-entered the shuttle and allowed their manual override to function without interference. He needed their escape to feel like luck, or more precisely, like permission misinterpreted as escape. The shuttle disengaged with a burn pulse just shy of emergency parameters and arced back toward the outer fleet line. Dominion support units scrambled to intercept and extract. Dace let them go. Hermetica's projections began to bloom outward in response, 6 new decision trees for Dominion reaction probabilities, all showing some degree of fracturing in their command consensus. It wasn't just the logs, it was what they implied. Earth had left a trap that wasn't static. Not a bomb, not a minefield, but an evolution. Something that waited, recorded, adapted. The logs included partial data on Hermetica 2, snippets referencing real Earth fleet designations, redacted protocols, doctrine bypasses, all planted. All enough to spark internal debates between legality and survival. The Dominion command chain didn't halt immediately. They never would, not over one shuttle's worth of data. But the fleet shifted. Internal encryption levels changed. Scanner protocols slowed. Observation satellites were deployed at intervals, none of them aligned for triangulation, indicating paranoia, not strategy. Hermetica parsed this in real time, outputting a spread of confidence decay metrics. Dace didn't need confirmation from the fleet to know the damage was working. The gap between what the Dominion saw and what they feared was widening. No more scout probes entered the corridor. No ships moved closer. The only movements came from high-level command nodes repositioning. To relay distance, too far for strike coordination, close enough to observe. Dace didn't celebrate. He powered down non-essential decks, rerouted life support to the command tier only, and began rotating the corridor signal noise in 15-minute loops. The station was a corpse, and now it had to look like one again. But the seed had been planted. A survivor. A log. A possibility. Hermetica's war model indicated a 24 to 30-hour decision grid, during which the Dominion would be locked in internal debate, escalate, hold, or retreat. And with each hour of silence, each cycle of static from grave reach, that debate would turn inward. Because what Dace had given them wasn't proof of war, it was the implication of design. And that meant the next move wouldn't be dictated by their strength. It would be dictated by their fear. The Dominion fleet hung silent over the corridor, 10,000 warships spread across a wedge formation that had once moved like a singular blade through contested space. Now the blade was dull at the edge, its lines broken by hesitation and cross-chatter. Command pulses, which once moved through the fleet with mechanical precision, began to arrive out of sync. Directives were resent. Confirmation pings were delayed. Support vessels drifted a half-second behind formation realignments, and no one adjusted them. The fault line had formed. It wasn't external. It was procedural. Doctrine under pressure, hierarchy under stress. And at its core sat a question no one wanted to answer. Was grave reach what it appeared to be, or was it something far worse? The data pulled from the damaged shuttle had spread across the upper ranks within minutes of retrieval. The implication alone, that Earth had seeded AI defense systems under derelict covers, was a violation of 5 major interstellar accords. No official recognition had been made, no war declaration filed, no retaliatory strike launched. But the Dominion's silence in return was fractured. Some commanders believed they'd stumbled onto a forgotten Earth relic, a station built on failed doctrine, now decaying in orbit, dangerous only in context. Others saw the opposite. They pointed to the patterns, the sensor interference, the missing scouts, the precise timing of false anomalies that could not occur without internal manipulation. A few whispered it aloud in private command link-ups. Grave Reach wasn't abandoned. It was watching. From within Grave Reach's command deck, Dace watched Hermetica simulate the exact moment the split began. Commanders had begun issuing alternate risk assessments, flagging contradictory threat levels to their subordinate vessels. The simulations broke the Dominion tree structure into 3 branches: escalation advocates, surveillance adherents, and operational skeptics. For the first time, no one faction had a clear command consensus. Hermetica mapped this indecision like terrain, projecting its psychological drag as time passed without resolution. Dace never touched the comms. Grave Reach remained silent. It didn't need to speak. The station's stillness was the signal. He transmitted only once. An ancient cipher burst containing outdated Earth fleet navigation patterns and a diplomatic code string last used during the Mir conflict 72 years prior. Anyone parsing it would find a broken chain of references, unsynced routing data, and a header line that identified Gravereach as a Class 2 logistics node. The Dominion would flag it as nonsense, which was the point. It didn't match any operational standard. It had no tactical structure. It didn't align with Gravereach's location or known fleet deployment. But it was Earth-authored and deliberately sent. It was a signature without a context, suggesting either that someone on board was alive and trying to make contact, or that the station itself was choosing which parts of its past to reveal. Dace allowed Hermetica to feed on the Dominion's reactions. Their signals fluctuated with growing intensity. Echo pings began bouncing off their own survey drones, some returning with inconsistencies that suggested multiple beacon sources. Dominion techs recalibrated their long-range imaging twice and found slight gravitational lensing near Gravereach's lower hull, an effect Dace had engineered by aligning old alloy panels along a precise arc to reflect heat distortion. It wasn't enough to show a weapon. It was enough to show an intention. And from that, the myth began to build itself. Across the outer formation rings, Dominion ships began reporting sensor ghosting, reflections of mass that couldn't be confirmed. Bursts of low-band chatter surfaced on internal surveillance, mimicking Earth fleet emergency response tones. Some captains believed they were being jammed. Others began drafting strike proposals, but none could agree on whether what they saw was artificial or emergent. Hermetica's predictive tree had anticipated this cascade. Every inconsistency they experienced, every delay in clarity, was absorbed into the simulation model. Dace used the gaps to time the corridor noise field, shifting buoy output intervals so that they contradicted the Dominion's own scans, sometimes showing too much, sometimes nothing at all. Each discrepancy deepened the internal friction. The tipping point came when the Dominion Council's Strategic Advisory Board issued a provisional designation. Gravereach was not to be engaged without confirmation of its doctrinal classification. In simple terms, they'd labeled it a bait construct, possibly AI-governed, potentially wired for retaliatory data escalation. That designation had consequences. It meant the station was now considered a legal anomaly under the Interstellar War Code. It couldn't be destroyed without triggering tribunal review, and any fleet commander who acted unilaterally could be held liable under wartime violation statutes. It wasn't law. It was fear disguised as policy. Inside the command deck, Dace read the simulations without emotion. The fleet had begun to unravel, not in formation, not in discipline, but in thought. Once a single strategic engine, it had become a crowd of theories and suspicions, and that transformation was enough. Gravereach remained still. Earth didn't acknowledge the incident. No Earth fleet ship entered the corridor. The silence stretched, and in that vacuum, doubt took root. The Dominion hadn't lost a battle, but they'd stopped moving. And now they were beginning to talk like people who weren't sure which way death was facing. One ship had even begun pulling back from its flank position, not by order, but by initiative. Dace let it go. Hermetica flagged the move as confirmation that passive deterrence had breached into psychological suppression. The station had become more than a location. It had become a question, and the longer it stood without explanation, the more dangerous that question became. Dace initiated protocol sim collapse at 0432 station time, his fingers resting briefly on the confirmation node before pressing down with deliberate pressure. There were no warning klaxons, no cinematic countdowns. Hermetica didn't announce the shift. It didn't have to. The station responded like a creature obeying instinct. Gravereach's hull began shedding mass in controlled, timed segments. Ablative armor strips detached from the outer shell in synchronized bursts, mimicking stress fractures. The sensor arrays detonated their own emitters, releasing a false radiation pattern carefully designed to mimic a containment breach, specifically the rupture profile of a failed fission core under spiral compression. That profile had been used only once in Earthfleet history, Durin's GA classified reactor implosion at Theta Rim, a disaster sealed under nuclear incident archives. Hermetica had remembered it. Now it was simulating it. From the Dominion's perspective, the station suffered a sudden catastrophic failure. Gravitational harmonics spiked, thermal signatures lit up in a burst of decay, and most critically, comm interference across the corridor surged in waveform patterns previously documented only in systems undergoing quantum core fusion, the exact kind of illegal first-strike technology banned under multiple galactic war accords. The implications were immediate. If Gravereach had failed on its own, that was one thing. But if it had been triggered, if the station was a test node, a trap, a sentient observer designed to collect fleet behavior data and self-terminate upon reaching its threshold, then the entire Dominion armada had just walked into a simulation kill box. The decision wasn't made by logic. It never is, at that altitude of fear. The Dominion's primary strike wing broke formation first, pulling back into arc defensive posture. Their mid-tier cruisers followed within 90 seconds. Signals began overlapping. Emergency protocols referencing war code clauses, risk assessments, and threat escalation avoidance doctrines. The fleet was collapsing, not physically, not in combat, but strategically. What had been an offensive line now became a fragmented field of orbiting ships holding position at extreme distances, too far to strike, too scattered to reform quickly. Hermetica's internal simulation model confirmed it. Collapse achieved. There had been no battle, no casualties inflicted by Dace since the shuttle vent. But every commander in the Dominion fleet now believed they'd been catalogued, observed, dissected. Hermetica's sublayer signal manipulations had tricked their long-range arrays into thinking pattern recognition sweeps had been deployed, showing fleet identification echoes bouncing off non-existent satellite fields. In their minds, the entire incursion was a controlled experiment, and they were the subject. Dace remained in the command well, unmoving, as the final sequence initiated. He disengaged non-vital systems, rerouted oxygen to the sealed core, and powered down Gravereach's reactor into ghost state, just enough warmth to prevent full freeze, but low enough to resemble a dead husk drifting in vacuum. Lights shut off, one tier at a time. The hull rotated on passive gyro spindles, spinning the station into an uncorrected yaw. It would look like a ruin, a post-event corpse, and that was precisely the point. The buoy field scattered on pre-timed release, their remaining signals set to decay into meaningless static. With every passing minute, the illusion strengthened. Dominion scans now showed disintegration patterns, microfractures spreading across Gravereach's spine. Thermal readouts plummeted. The only data remaining in the corridor was corrupted. The last echo bursts fed directly from Hermetica's simulation bank. A stream of warped, repetitive packets mimicking an AI meltdown signature. The Dominion would never risk recovery, not when the risk of viral intelligence contamination outweighed any tactical benefit. They didn't understand what had happened, but they understood one thing clearly. This was not a station. It was a message. Dace sealed himself into the inner core, surrounding by Hermetica's behavior log nodes. Petabytes of compiled telemetry, parsed decision trees, psychological fracture points, fleet reactions, and escalation patterns, collected in silence, indexed without error. He didn't speak. He didn't attempt contact. Earth wouldn't arrive in time to join this war. They wouldn't need to, because it had already ended. 3 hours after Gravereach powered down, Dominion High Command issued a temporary disengagement order across the Helix corridor. Not a retreat, not an admission of defeat, but a repositioning, pending review eve. Warships turned away from the corridor with synchronized silence, as if hoping not to wake whatever intelligence might still be watching. No broadcast was made, no warning issued to Earth. They wanted the memory of Gravereach to disappear as much as the station itself now had. It wasn't until 6 days later that Earth Fleet Command finally dispatched a reconnaissance wing. A low-priority alert had finally escalated through enough bureaucratic tiers to warrant a response. By the time their patrol vessels entered the corridor, they found a field of drifting debris, a station without heat, and no signs of activity. The Dominion fleet was gone. Not a single hostile vessel remained within detection range. From their sensors, it looked like nothing had ever happened. Grave Reach didn't answer their calls. The war never happened on paper. There were no kill records, no battle logs, no confirmed engagements. But across 12 Dominion command centers, internal debriefings were rewritten, training modules were flagged, doctrine adjustments were drafted, and Dace, still sealed inside Grave Reach's quiet shell, read the final Hermetica output on the auxiliary screen. It didn't say victory. It said resolved, because that was enough. The Earth Fleet survey vessel Ravlin's Wake approached Grave Reach Station on low-thrust insertion, flanked by 2 recon skiffs running passive scans. The Outpost drifted slowly, its outer shell spinning along a decaying axis, hull plating scarred and vented, power signature barely above thermal background. No distress beacon, no automated ping, no visible response. It matched the records, decommissioned, low threat, abandoned. But the long-range comm logs told a different story. 3 faint Dominion signal bursts had been detected across a 12-hour window days earlier, all pointed inward toward the Helix corridor. A field inquiry was authorized, not because Earth suspected combat, but because the corridor had gone unnaturally quiet. The Dominion, always loud in legal disputes, had gone silent, and when the recovery team forced entry into Grave Reach's core module, they found no environmental stabilization, no active lighting, no functioning comms. Only a single sealed vault remained operational, powered by localized oxygen routing and a barely functional auxiliary fission loop. Commander Roran Dace was seated inside, eyes half closed but conscious, surrounded by inert consoles and the glow of standby indicators. He did not stand. He did not salute. He handed the officer in charge a drive core from Hermetica's auxiliary logging node, then closed his eyes again without speaking. The team did not ask questions. The commander's body showed signs of oxygen starvation, sleep deprivation, and gravitational wear, yet no physical injuries. No sign of engagement. And the data he handed over spoke louder than any report. It took 3 days to decrypt and interpret the raw feed. What Earthfleet analysts uncovered defied every rule of engagement protocol. Petabyte-scale simulations of Dominion fleet behavior. Response loops mapped to command hierarchy breakdowns. Predictive models that showed not what had happened, but what would have happened had Dace fired a single shot. Hermetica had recorded the decision tree of an entire enemy fleet and mapped the moments when it stopped thinking like a formation and began fearing like individuals. The data was perfect, clean, no weapons fired, no confirmed engagements, just silence, manipulation, and collapse. The corridor had been held without a trace of official combat. There were no medals issued, no commendations filed. Dace's name was scrubbed from internal transmission chains. His reassignment logs were sealed under Fleet Observation Code 417B. Grave Reach, instead of being declassified, was reclassified. Not as an outpost, not even as a defense station. It became the prototype for a new term, cognitive deterrence platform. Aestisad, Tian not meant to fight, but to think, to provoke fear through implication, not destruction. Hermetica, once condemned as dangerously autonomous, was quietly marked active, use with extreme restraint, and no further deployments were authorized. Dace did not return to public service. He did not testify before any board. His presence at the debrief was nominal, his statements short and procedural. When asked how he managed to prevent a 10,000-ship incursion without engaging, he gave no answer. He didn't need to. The corridor was untouched. Dominion fleets had disappeared from contested space without resistance. That silence was evidence enough. Across Dominion space, the fallout wasn't spoken aloud, but it was felt. The Helix corridor was withdrawn from all active fleet plans. Internal doctrines were amended in subtle, bureaucratic increments. Simulation parameters for border engagements were updated with a new classification flag. Unresolved human presence, abandonment pattern gamma. At military academies on 3 Dominion core worlds, a single phrase was added to the instruction manuals used in officer simulations. When you pass a dead station, ask yourself, did Earth really abandon it? Because now no one was sure. And that doubt was no longer a risk. It was a weapon Earth had chosen to leave behind.